ago that the authorities of human rights from the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission denounced systematic and ongoing repression addressed to journalists and workers in mass media in Nicaragua. Unfortunately, the situation of hostility towards the exercise of freedom of expression in Nicaragua goes on. Multilateral organisms, agencies, and civil society organizations in Nicaragua continue to document numerous attacks against journalists and independent communication media, including stigmatizing discourses by high authorities, criminal causes against journalists, aggression and harassment to journalists, threats, physical aggressions, among others. The confiscation of premises of communication media continues, as well as civil society organizations, to which boards saying that they belong to the Ministry of Health in Nicaragua have been placed. These aggressions against the press compromises democracy and the right to an informed society, with particularly serious consequences in the context of the general elections that will be held in Nicaragua in November this year. As the UN High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet said, the measures adopted by the Nicaraguan government are a clear example of the continuous restriction or shrinking of the democratic and civic space in the framework of these elections. Today, we'll hear the perspective of 4 notable Nicaraguan journalists who very creatively and very bravely have decided to continue informing in spite of large challenges and high personal costs. We have Néstor Arce, director and multimedia producer at Divergentes, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, director of Confidencial, Kimberly León, journalist at La Costeñísima, and Lucía Pineda, director and journalist at 100% Noticias. You can find their full biographies on this event's webpage. I'm also happy to tell you that we'll have the comments at the end of the discussion of Dr. Pedro Vaca, who's the special rapporteur for freedom of expression at the Organization of American States and the Commission of Human Rights. And before we move on to our discussion, we'll have the pleasure to have some introductory comments by Mr. Michael Grant, Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas from Canada. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize the support of the Government of Canada for this discussion and also their commitment to freedom of expression in the region, and particularly in Nicaragua. My particular thanks to Ambassador Hugh Atzet and the whole team of the Canada mission to the OAS, and Mr. James Hill, Ambassador of Canada to Nicaragua. Without further ado, we'll now listen to the message by Mr. Michael Brandt of this important discussion about freedom of press in the context of the upcoming election in Nicaragua. I'm sorry not to be able to be in person, but I'm happy to be accompanied by James Hill, Canadian Ambassador to Nicaragua, and Hugh Atzet, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the OAS, who are present today in this event. We have been observing with concern the shrinking of the democratic space in Nicaragua in the past few years after the political and human rights crisis where many members of the press were arrested. Since then, the situation has continued to worsen. The impact of the pandemic and the destruction caused by hurricanes by the end of 2020 have exacerbated the suffering of the Nicaraguan people. And even though the international community, including Canada, has brought supply and other types of aids, these don't solve the underlying problems linked to democracy, human rights, and transparent governance. The upcoming election is more important than ever. Elections are not only voting in the context of fair elections, but they should guarantee that citizens are informed. The Nicaraguan people, as any citizens in the Americas and the world, are entitled to listen to all the candidates, to get involved in political parties, and to be exposed to a plurality of viewpoints to make an informed decision when they vote. Informed voting depends on independent journalism. Free and fair elections and freedom of press are the basis of democracy. The government of Canada is particularly concerned about the shrinking of the democratic space in Nicaragua and the measures addressed to communication means, media. These are known examples of the policing of journalists and situations of serious threats against reporters. We are also highly concerned about the recent legislation to repress even more the freedom of press in Nicaragua. At present, Nicaraguan communication media cannot exert their fundamental role in a democratic society. Canada and our partners are working through the OAS and the UN to call attention to this situation. Last week, at the Council on Human Rights from the UN, Canada worked with partners to the successful adoption of a resolution about the promotion and protection of human rights in Nicaragua. This resolution called attention to the intimidation, harassment, and policing, which are arbitrary and illegal against many journalists. I really appreciate the Nicaraguan media that have accepted to participate in this panel today. We commend their determination and devotion to defend free, independent, diverse communication media in Nicaragua. We wish to listen to how all the international community can continue to support the efforts of independent journalists who persevere to cover the electoral process in Nicaragua. The Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, Mr. Pedro Vaca, has been monitoring very closely freedom of expression and freedom of press in Nicaragua. We welcome his participation in this event. As co-chair of the Working Group on Nicaragua, the OAS, Canada is committed to fostering a peaceful resolution to the current crisis, and we continue to encourage Nicaragua to work with the OAS and its member states with this purpose. Finally, I want my special thanks to Inter-American Dialogue for organizing this excellent panel. Canada is happy to cooperate with you on such a critical issue. Thank you, Michael, and over to you to start the event.
Muy bien, le agradecemos muchísimo.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Grant, for this important message. I believe this shows the concern of the international community around this issue. Let's now move on to our discussion. I would like to ask the first question for Mr. Carlos Fernando Chamorro, the attacks against freedom of expression in Nicaragua since Mr. Ortega came back to power are nothing new, but clearly since 2018, things have escalated. We would like, in order to share about this reality with our audience, share a few images about recent events that took place in Nicaragua. And then I would like you to comment on some of these images. Let's share the video now. General elections, November 2021, will set the path of Nicaragua. Journalists are being attacked. Watch out. The United Nations and the Inter-American Commission point out serious violations against freedom. On 7th of November 2021, the rule of law continues to break. Independent journalists claim they are being persecuted and harassed. We are out in the street. We know anything can happen. Some of us have been imprisoned. Some have been prosecuted. Already there are rulings against us. Journalists and citizens point out that the threat to a freedom of expression is out there. To be able to do critical journalism under this new model, those who defend human rights want to see that there's an electoral process without any issues. We want to provide a greater offer of contents so as to be able to have decisions based on facts, on information.
Nosotros pues hemos denunciado que esto es un
We
robo.
have made claims. We are being robbed. Our TV channel has been snatched from our hands. This used to be so-called terrorist mass media headquarters. They will not prevent us from continuing to spread the word. We, the free press. Mr. Carlos, we've just seen some footage on the current events you're going through at the moment. Could you please share, in your view, what is it like to be a journalist in Nicaragua right now? What are the consequences for the Nicaraguan society? Thank you so much, Michael, and Inter-American Dialogue, to allow us to share our realities with the also Organization of American States Special Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression. In Nicaragua, for about 2 years, the agreements that Mr. Ortega made with the Alliance to Open Dialogue have been breached. So this is to do with freeing political prisoners and restoring democratic freedom, freedom of association, freedom to move around, freedom of press, freedom of expression, university autonomy. All these agreements have not been followed. And now there's a police status, let's say. Every day when I leave home, my ID is checked by the police. Sometimes even my picture is taken, and they are constantly out there watching. We journalists are hacked, are persecuted. when we are working. So this is the context under which there will be allegedly elections in Nicaragua this year. So I believe freedom of press and the suspension of censorship goes hand in hand with the demand of freedom of political prisoners and stopping this police status. Last year, new laws were passed in order to legalize what so far has been de facto censorship. For instance, the cybercrime law establishes the fake news crime punishable by 3 years of jail. And what is fake news or false information or misinformation? This is not defined. In 2018, this started with Angel Gaona's murder, the destruction of a radio station, aggressions to the journalists, seizure of 100% news, 100% noticias, and the penalization of journalists after Miguel Mora and Lucia Pineda were caught. She's here with us. So the consequence is what we can see now, how mass media tries to launder this crime, let's say, by passing this on to the realm of the health ministry. But we were never silenced. We've been seized, we've been attacked, but we've always informed from Nicaragua or from exile. And this goes hand in hand with the demand of freedom of expression by citizens. In Nicaragua, there is quality journalism, despite the political polarization, the lack of access to public information in issues regarding, for instance, the pandemic or the COVID-19. There is transparency, there is public transparency, especially because this resistance that free press offers. There is no freedom of press, but we do journalism, but we are threatened to go to jail, with going to jail, or even knowing that we can be attacked and seriously injured. Thank you so much, Carlos Fernando. That was very, very clear. You also mentioned our other guest speaker today, Lucia Pineda, who can also be seen in this video. Good morning, Lucia. Let me take you to some of the elements that Carlos Fernando mentions. Clearly, the situation of freedom of press in Nicaragua is hard, as we saw in the video and as Mr. Carlos pointed out, but also Nicaraguan press has continued to inform, and you might want to share with us, how do you view this in terms of what are the measures that the press is adopting in Nicaragua to continue to inform despite these hardships? Hello, I'm having some issues with my internet connection. As I've been saying, freedom in Nicaragua stays on despite this emergency alert. There's been an attempt to silence us and to silence communication media. Last year, 4 journalists were brought to trial for slander. There's a cost. I'm sorry, Lucia, may I interrupt? Would you like to turn off your camera? Maybe then we would get better sound. Perhaps if you'd like to remember you're being interpreted, so you might want to slow down. Right. So what I was saying is that there is like a red alert in Nicaragua. That is to say, freedoms of Nicaraguans, freedom of press, we defend by doing our job, by informing. If we hadn't done this, independent journalists, perhaps in this case, I'm referring to freedom of the press. There's a new methodology now to blame the regime for everything that has been happening. This year, apparently, journalists are to blame for everything that is going wrong in our country. Now, this is clearly a sign that we are being persecuted. That we feel we are being spied on. For instance, police check everything when we are there. So we feel we are being harassed constantly. In February, illegal occupation was evident, and having the buildings appear to belong to the health ministry shows clearly that this illegal seizure will continue, and that we are all at stake. They can take over anything they want, any building, any bank. We are all, they're out to get us, all of us. They are freely operating. So the future seems bleak around the electoral period. More violence. And what's going on with us, the messengers, the journalists? We hope no more blood will be shed. There is no certainty. We are being run over by Mr. Daniel Ortega regarding attacks, censorship on the independent press. Thank you so much, Lucia, and thank you for trying. Sometimes technology does not help. It's very important to see what you are sharing.
Buen día a todos.
Bienvenida.
Good morning, everyone. So, I will ask you about La Costeñísima, because it's the first multimedia from the Costa Caribe, Nicaragua, and guided by the principle of promoting the multi-ethnic and pluricultural notions in the country. So last year, the Violeta Chamorro Foundation concluded in a report that violations to freedom of press had increased, specifically in this autonomous region of the Caribe Sur area. So I'd like to hear from you. What is it like, and how is the struggle between the regional struggle and the struggle for freedom of press interrelate?
Sí, buenos días a todos. Bueno, la lucha por la libertad de prensa en nuestra región.
Yes, the fight for the freedom of press in our region has been very difficult lately because things are getting worse and were getting worse in the past few years. People and journalists can no longer decide by ourselves. We now have to be very cautious as to whom we speak, who we meet, where we go, because it's a persecution we've suffered that cannot let us do our job as we want, because we know we can be today in one place, and we also know that anything can happen to us. We are exposed to any type of intimidation. Journalists, day by day, need to be careful with what we publish with this issue of the cybercrimes law, because if we publish we shouldn't or something they think it's wrong, they'll start or we'll start to receive libel and slander. We'll start to be, finger pointed because we say something that in their view is wrong, but we know we tell the truth, but they don't like to hear the truth from us. It's a very difficult situation at the Caribbean coast because it's a very small place, and journalists, we are afraid all the time that we may leave our houses, but we don't know if we will come back. We may be at the office today, but the police forces arrive and intimidate us. They stand outside our houses. So it's a situation that's very bad for everybody emotionally, our everyday life. But in spite of that, we continue to inform, to open the doors to people, because people also are afraid, but they try not to show it. Why? Because most people work at government institutions and are aware that if they say something they shouldn't say, they will be sacked. So they are afraid to express themselves. We cannot get to interview people who work at these institutions because they are afraid of dismissal. And we do know those people live on their salary. So we journalists live with that fear, but people too, because they don't feel free to say what they think, to say what they want. We are all afraid, and this fear is caused by this situation, but we continue to fight. We will continue to inform at whatever price because we love our job, and we know that if we continue to inform the truth, one day we'll have freedom of expression in our region. Thank you very much, Kimberly. Excellent answer. Néstor Arce, good morning and welcome. We've heard already from our guests the hostile and difficult environment for the freedom of expression in Nicaragua right now. This adds up to economic factors and economic asphyxiation, which have led to the closing of over 20 communication media in the past 13 years in Nicaragua. So the situation is not easy for a communication media. However, you at Divergentes decided to launch last year a new media in the middle of a pandemic, and in spite of all these obstacles, Divergentes is a digital media that offers diversified content and a non-traditional dissemination strategy, including podcasts and an active presence on social media. My question is, why have you decided to launch Divergentes in such an adverse context? Can these new forms of communication eliminate at least party the barriers imposed by Ortega's government. Thank you, Michael, very much. And thank you, Inter-American Dialogue, for inviting Divergentes. I think that we were and will continue to be cheeky, let's say, to doing journalism in this controversial country. My other colleagues have described the risk of doing journalism in this country. But 4 colleagues, we met and started to discuss how we could continue to work as journalists. Journalism that is called slow journalism, to take advantage of these digital tools, including narratives and new formats, to create Divergentes. Since 2018, the Fundación Violeta Chamorro has a record of more or less 20 new communication media created after the social crisis in 2018. Also, outside the country by some colleagues in exile who have created online media or use social network to continue to inform. We analyzed this overview and said that we applaud the creation of new spaces of information, but there's a lot of breaking news. It's okay, that contributes or adds up to information for people and breaks the barrier of censorship in some blogs that Daniel Ortega's and Rosario Murillo's regime want to impose in the country. However, we thought we had to do something different, so we started to think of Divergentes and devise it. We said we wanted to use all these new platforms, as you said. We are created some sort of roaring or sound, let's say, journalism through podcasts. We obtained an award for a podcast about sexual violence of Daniel Ortega's regime in jail to political prisoners since 2018 and political dissidents, and how we have taken advantage of graphic resources, infographies. So we wanted to create a space that offers opportunities for narrators, journalists, reporters that can write good stories based on these multimedia formats that can break this barrier and take advantage of the resources Nicaragua offers. In Nicaragua, internet penetration has grown. People use mobile devices more and more. There are data saying that there is 2.7 cells by every Nicaraguan. So we want to take advantage of this technological advance through social media, through a comfortable and fast charging website that can be navigated on the cell phones. So we thought of all these opportunities technology is given us now. There are a few household connections, so people use Facebook, TikTok, Twitter. So we see how we can expand the frontier of journalism if we respect the rigorous character of journalism. We come from big newsrooms. Now we have Divergentes newsroom formed by young people from 20 to 36 years old. I think the young spirit of this newsroom and this daring attitude has let us continue to do journalism in a country where we pay a very high price. Sometimes we face laws that intend to censor us, the laws of cybercrimes, the foreign agents law that want to ban independent media in Nicaragua because there are no commercial opportunities for business models of communication media to be sustainable. So they want to stifle communication media. We've heard this from my other colleagues, but there are also opportunities and ideas, and we need to be creative to continue to educate, create, and take advantage of all these platforms that give us a lot of advantages. Excellent. Thank you very much, Nestor. I'd like now to continue with this topic of creativity and the attitude of Nicaraguan journalists to overcome barriers and obstacles. Carlos Fernando, one of the realities that the community of Nicaraguan journalists had to face is exile. We calculate that more than 70 Nicaraguan reporters were exiled. However, in many cases, they succeeded in continuing to inform from abroad. In your particular case, you spent some time outside Nicaragua, then you decided to return in spite of the risks involved. Please tell us, what was your experience in your case to work outside Nicaragua, and you've made a decision to return to Nicaragua, and how your experience has been in general for communication media to continue to work from abroad? Yes, I was exiled on January the 1st, 2019, to protect my physical integrity, my freedom, and that of my wife, and to continue to work. We had suffered the assault on the newsroom at Confidencial and the assault to 100% Noticia, and Pineda and Miguel Mora were already detained. I was information that there were orders by the regime to capture me and process me as other journalists. So the only way that I could continue in journalism was to preserve my liberty. I went to Costa Rica, and the great majority of the people who worked for Confidencial stayed in Nicaragua, and that was one of the major reasons that led us continue to do journalism in Nicaragua, continuing with journalists and eyes that could produce information through the internet and social media. My exile in Costa Rica, I found really a lot of empathy from many colleagues from Teletica, Ignacio Santos, Channel 7, that offered me a large platform to get reorganized and reorganize the whole production of Confidencial along with other media who were exiled in El Salvador, the United States, and also in Mexico. So we had a newsroom in Nicaragua and an organized newsroom in exile. When the dictatorship censored us on TV and asked access that esta semana and esta noche be broadcasted through cable, we used YouTube and Facebook, and our access to that community, people who consume information through social media, multiplied by up to 10 times. From 20,000 subscribers, we had more than 260,000 subscribers on YouTube. I returned because of the same reasons I left, because I considered it was worthwhile to take the risk to come back to work in Nicaragua free after Lucia Pineda and Miguel Mora were released from prison in 2019. There were no guarantees either for myself or for any other journalists who decided to return. We first waited for the return of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the UN Commission on Human Rights, and that's exiled. That's requested by all people in exile to return at least with verification, but we didn't succeed in that. We came back on our own security risk to challenge the regime in Nicaragua, and I returned on November 25th, 2019, after 11 months in exile, as well as other members of our team. We reorganized in Nicaragua to become stronger in our call for freedom of expression of the confiscated media. We didn't succeed in that, but we returned to Nicaragua to continue doing journalism here and have more direct contact with the sources. The resistance of journalism in exiles is extraordinary. Our colleagues in Costa Rica and the United States and Spain, in other parts of the world, cannot come back because their condition of insecurity is very important in their places where they live, the municipalities. Their risk is much higher, and everyone has to measure their own risk and security conditions. Today, we concluded that we could take the risk, and I think it was the right decision. I cannot ask from all my colleagues to do the same when they don't have the same conditions, but I'm persuaded that it's a mission and responsibility for journalism to be the highest source of expression. First of all, doing quality journalism, and if possible, in Nicaragua, having a more direct contact with our reality and our sources, and to say face to face to their dictatorship, as we did and we do every day, that we are for the freedom of association, freedom of press, freedom of expression, that I think is much more resonant to promote changes than the change that all Nicaraguans want.
Thank you, Carlos. Lucia, I hope you're still there, despite you are having some technological issues. Many times we've already talked about the tension that you went through. Also, with the director of 100% Noticias, you were detained arbitrarily over 170 days. Now, this is
una muestra de fuerza por
an
parte
action that
del
seems
gobierno.
to reveal that there's a lot of weakness at the backdrop. And I might ask, in your opinion, why is the Nicaraguan government so afraid of free press? Why does it need to take this arbitrary action and destructive action? What's your take on this? That you went through yourself. Daniel Ortega and Rosario, I'm afraid I cannot understand because the connection is very poor. Perhaps she interrupted her video. Violation of human rights, persecution and attacks on demonstrators. We were vulnerable. And this upset Daniel Ortega's regime. Violation on human rights is documented. There's video footage, there's proof. They are right to be afraid of being in Nicaragua. This coverage cost our freedom. The TV channel and exile. And it could have cost our lives. We were almost killed, but thank God we can be here to reiterate our commitment. We cannot be silenced. We were not silenced. I didn't take holiday. I didn't see a psychologist. I couldn't waste a minute. Nicaragua needs free, courageous, committed press. Journalists that document, that report what's happening, 24/7. And this is part of the contribution that 100% Noticias has brought to report right there and then what's happening in the country. So now we have our own resources. Our family helps us also to continue to work. This was asked of us, and we delivered, and we would do it again, and it was worth it. We were asked to cover this news, and we did. We confronted the regime. We put up with horrible, horrendous pressure. We were harassed. We resisted, and that's what we must do. Not being intimidated, not being silenced. Sometimes I confronted policemen. I said, "Why are you harassing us? We represent no danger to the nation. We only report what's happening in Nicaragua." And many times the world took up on this through the IACHR. And this was documented as something of historic value, that it can also be found in YouTube. This is Nicaragua. This is our coverage. So the presidency cannot put up with the truth. So when someone stands up straight, strong, and says, "I will continue to report the truth," you are attacked. You are censored. And that's what happened here. We told the truth, and we were imprisoned, tortured physically and psychologically. This was illegal. We are proud. We are still standing. And this is worth it. Nicaragua is worth it. Thank you, Lucia. I'm glad that you brought up several significant elements regarding what you've yourself experienced and what has been documented by multilateral organizations. So now we are getting some questions from the audience, which is great. Some questions on how this situation is being assessed and the kind of violation to the freedom of expression in Nicaragua. And I must say that in the reports by organizations such as the IACHR, OHCHR, that have considered this a systematic violation to freedom of expression. So, of course, we are complementing these reports to the life experience of these 4 journalists that are here with us today. So if there's anyone who wants more detail or has questions about what's happening in Nicaragua, I'd like to invite you to revise the reports published by the organizations I've mentioned. So following up on the discussion, Kimberly, I'd like to come back to you. La Costeñísima has also suffered from repression in many ways, which include intimidation by policemen and paramilitaries, but also less visibly so. For instance, legal claims brought against them, financial suffocation, pressure on sponsors. Please share, in your experience, how have these pressure measures impacted you, and how have you managed to overcome them so as to continue to inform, to report? Right. So this intimidation and persecutions, as I was saying before, we experience daily in our work, in our homes, and even we've been threatened. We've been told that now we will be run by the state, our mass media unit. And we know that this is to intimidate us, for us to show that we are afraid. But as I said, there's been claims for slander. So this situation was experienced. We shared it with her also because it's part of our broadcasting agency. And that's very touchy. Feelings are to do with this because she did what she liked to do, but when she was reported, she was afraid. It's not that she didn't know what pieces of news to work on, but she was just afraid, you know, because there had been a claim brought against her. So even so, she overcame little by little this process, and she